strength of Egypt is our unity.
The legions are loyal to you, sire.
By the will of the gods, we declare you united as King and Queen of Egypt.
We accept this sacred duty.
Cleopatra married her own brother when she was 18 years old. He was 10, not as a metaphor, not as some loose ancient phrase for a political alliance, an actual marriage. An actual 10-year-old boy declared her husband and co-ruler of Egypt under a wedding that Egyptian royal tradition required. 4 years later, she had driven him into a river where he drowned trying to escape her soldiers. Most people who know anything about Cleopatra know the Rome stories: Caesar, Mark Antony, the asp, the suicide, the end of an empire. Almost nobody knows that before any of that happened, Cleopatra fought a brutal, multi-year civil war against her own brother-husband, a war that involved siege, assassination, foreign armies burning their way through Alexandria, and one of the most catastrophic accidental losses in the history of human knowledge. She was barely 20 years old through most of it. And the way she won says more about who Cleopatra actually was than the love affairs that history decided to remember her for. This is not the Cleopatra of perfume ads and Hollywood. This is a teenage queen fighting for her life against her own family, in a system designed specifically to make sure she couldn't survive it alone. She survived it alone anyway. To understand why Cleopatra married a 10-year-old, you have to understand the dynasty she was born into. The Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years by the time Cleopatra was born in 69 BC. They were not Egyptian by origin. The dynasty began with Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who took control of Egypt after Alexander's death in 323 BC. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greek. They ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries and, with rare exceptions, never bothered to learn the Egyptian language. Cleopatra was, famously, an exception. Ancient sources describe her as the first Ptolemaic ruler in the dynasty's history to actually speak Egyptian. But the family's internal customs were not Egyptian either, at least not entirely. They had adopted, alongside genuine elements of Egyptian royal practice, a custom that Egyptian pharaohs had also followed in earlier periods: sibling marriage among the ruling family. The logic, however brutal it sounds today, was political. In a system where royal power was concentrated and dynastic legitimacy mattered enormously, marrying outside the family created a rival power base. A foreign spouse with foreign interests, foreign relatives, foreign claims. Marrying within the family kept the bloodline pure, kept power concentrated, and theoretically reduced the risk of a husband or wife's external family interfering in succession. In practice, it produced one of the most violent and dysfunctional ruling families in ancient history. The Ptolemies murdered each other constantly. Siblings killed siblings, mothers killed sons. The family tree, if you actually map it out, looks less like a tree and more like a crime scene diagram. Cleopatra's own father, Ptolemy XII, had been forced into exile at one point by his own subjects and had to be restored to the throne with Roman military assistance. Assistance that came with an enormous financial cost that Egypt was still paying off when Cleopatra came to power. This is the family. This is the system. A 10-year-old husband was not an aberration in this context. It was Tuesday. Ptolemy XII died in 51 BC. His will specified that Egypt would be ruled jointly by his eldest surviving children, Cleopatra, who was 18, and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was around 10, and per Ptolemaic custom, joint rule between siblings meant marriage. This was not a romantic arrangement in any sense that would translate to modern understanding. It was an institutional formality, a political structure dressed in the language of marriage because that was the framework Ptolemaic royal succession operated within. Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII were married and crowned as co-rulers. The arrangement was unstable from the start, and not primarily because of anything Cleopatra or her brother did personally. Ptolemy XIII, being a child, was not actually exercising independent political judgment. He was a figurehead being managed by a group of court officials and advisors, most significantly a eunuch named Pothinus, who functioned as the boy king's regent and chief advisor, and a general named Achilles. These men had their own interests, and those interests did not necessarily align with sharing power equally with an 18-year-old queen who showed every sign of intending to actually rule rather than simply occupy a ceremonial position. Cleopatra, from the earliest surviving records of her reign, behaved like someone who intended to govern in fact, not just in name. Egyptian and Greek sources from this period show her name appearing first in official documents, ahead of her brothers, which was a deliberate and significant assertion of primacy in a culture where order of names in official inscriptions carried real political meaning. She was not interested in being a figurehead alongside a child king controlled by court officials. The court officials were not interested in losing control of the child king they were managing. This was always going to end in conflict. The only question was how quickly and how violently. It fell apart within about 3 years. By 49 or 48 BC, the conflict between Cleopatra and the faction controlling her brother had escalated to the point where Cleopatra was forced out of Alexandria entirely. Pothinus and Achilles, acting in Ptolemy XIII's name, had effectively staged what amounts to a palace coup. Cleopatra was expelled. She did not simply accept this. She fled to the eastern border region of Egypt and Syria and began raising an army. This detail matters enormously and gets lost in the popular Cleopatra narrative. She did not wait for rescue. She did not appeal to some external patron to fix her problem for her. She personally went into the field, in territory that was not fully under her control, and started building a military force capable of retaking her throne by force. This was a teenage queen, displaced from her capital by her own brother's regime, organizing an armed return. By 48 BC, she had assembled a mercenary army and was advancing on Egypt from the east, positioned near Pelusium, a fortified city at Egypt's eastern frontier that controlled access from Syria and the Sinai. Ptolemy XIII's forces, commanded by Achilles, moved to meet her. Egypt was on the verge of full civil war between a queen and her child husband's regime. And then something happened that changed the entire calculation. Pompey the Great arrived. To understand what happened next, you need a brief detour into Roman politics. Rome in 48 BC was in the middle of its own catastrophic civil war. Julius Caesar against Pompey the Great, formerly allies, now locked in a struggle for control of the entire Roman world. At the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece, in August 48 BC, Caesar decisively defeated Pompey's forces. Pompey fled. And he fled toward Egypt, a place where he had political connections, where his family had previously provided military support to Cleopatra's father, where he believed he could find refuge and potentially rebuild his position. He sailed toward Pelusium, where Ptolemy XIII's forces were camped, facing Cleopatra's advancing army. The advisors around the young king, Pothinus and Achilles, the same men who had driven Cleopatra out, now faced an extraordinarily dangerous decision. If they sheltered Pompey, and Caesar won the broader Roman civil war decisively, Egypt would be siding with the losing party in a conflict that could result in Roman military retaliation against Egypt itself. If they refused Pompey shelter, they risked offending a man who, if circumstances shifted, could still prove enormously powerful and dangerous to cross. They chose a third option. They had Pompey assassinated as he stepped off his boat onto Egyptian shores. According to ancient accounts, primarily Plutarch, Pompey was killed by men including a former Roman officer who had previously served under him on the orders of the Egyptian court, within sight of his own wife watching from the ship. His head was removed. The plan, as far as historians can reconstruct it, was to present Caesar with Pompey's head as a gift when Caesar arrived in pursuit, a demonstration of Egyptian loyalty to the apparent winning side, removing a problem before Caesar had to deal with it himself. It did not work the way they expected. Caesar arrived in Alexandria days after Pompey's murder, pursuing his defeated rival. He was presented with Pompey's head and signet ring. According to multiple ancient sources, Caesar's reaction was not gratitude. He reportedly wept. Whatever Caesar's personal feelings about Pompey, they had been political enemies locked in a war that had torn Rome apart. Pompey had also been Caesar's former son-in-law, ally, and one of the most significant figures in Roman history. The casual, brutal murder of a Roman statesman of that stature by a foreign court, presented as a political favour, was received as something closer to an outrage than a courtesy. It also created an immediate practical problem for the Egyptian court. Caesar had arrived in Alexandria with a relatively small Roman force, not enough to conquer Egypt outright, but enough to assert Roman authority in a way that the unstable Egyptian political situation could not easily ignore. And Caesar, ever the political operator, recognized an opportunity. Egypt was in the middle of a civil war between its co-rulers, Rome had outstanding financial claims on Egypt going back to the loans that had restored Cleopatra's father to his throne years earlier. Caesar positioned himself as an arbiter, invoking Ptolemy XII's will, which had specified joint rule between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII, and demanding that the two siblings resolve their dispute under his mediation. This was Caesar asserting Roman authority over Egyptian internal politics, dressed in the language of restoring a legitimate will. Ptolemy XIII's faction was furious. They had not invited Roman interference. They had been managing this conflict on their own terms, and now a Roman general with an army was inserting himself directly into the succession dispute. And Cleopatra saw in Caesar's arrival the single greatest opportunity of her young life. The story of Cleopatra entering Caesar's presence rolled in a carpet, or in some accounts a bedroll or sack, is one of the most famous anecdotes from ancient history. It comes primarily from Plutarch, writing roughly 150 years after the events, working from earlier sources that have not survived independently. The basic situation it describes is plausible regardless of the specific theatrical detail. Cleopatra was outside Alexandria, in territory controlled by forces loyal to her brother's regime. Entering the city and reaching Caesar directly without being captured or killed by Ptolemy XIII's faction along the way required some method of concealment. Whether it was literally a rolled carpet or a more mundane form of smuggling, the substance of the story is consistent with the political reality. Cleopatra needed to reach Caesar directly, privately, before her brother's advisors could prevent the meeting or shape Caesar's understanding of the situation first. She succeeded. What this meeting represented, stripped of the romantic gloss that later centuries applied to it, was an extraordinarily high-stakes political gambit by a 21-year-old queen. She was betting that she could personally persuade the most powerful man in the Roman world to back her claim over her brothers, in a dispute where the Egyptian court that controlled her brother had significant resources, an army, and considerable local support. It worked. Caesar backed Cleopatra. Whatever combination of political calculation, personal attraction, and genuine assessment of competence drove that decision. And ancient and modern historians disagree about the relative weight of each factor. The practical result was that the most powerful military force in the Eastern Mediterranean now stood behind Cleopatra's claim to the Egyptian throne. Ptolemy XIII's faction was not going to accept this. What followed is known to historians as the Alexandrian War. Pothinus and Achillas, controlling Ptolemy XIII and commanding a substantial Egyptian military force, moved against Caesar's much smaller Roman contingent in Alexandria. Caesar found himself, with a force far smaller than the Egyptian army opposing him, effectively under siege within the royal palace district of Alexandria. The fighting that followed was brutal and went on for months, through the winter of 48 to 47 BC. It involved combat through the streets and harbour of one of the greatest cities in the ancient world, naval engagements in the harbour itself, as both sides fought for control of access by sea, and it produced what historians widely consider one of the great cultural catastrophes of the ancient world. During the fighting, Caesar ordered ships in the harbour burned to prevent them from being used by Egyptian naval forces against his position. The fire spread. Ancient sources, including accounts that reference Seneca and Aulus Gellius writing decades later, describe significant destruction connected to this fire reaching into Alexandria's famous library complex, the greatest accumulation of written knowledge in the ancient world, housing scrolls representing centuries of Greek, Egyptian, and broader Mediterranean scholarship. The exact scale of destruction is genuinely debated among historians. Some ancient sources suggest catastrophic loss. Modern scholarship is more cautious, noting that the main library and the warehouse complex affected by the fire may have been somewhat distinct, and that the library's eventual decline over subsequent centuries likely had multiple causes beyond this single fire. But there is broad agreement that during this specific military conflict, a war that existed because Cleopatra was fighting her own brother for the Egyptian throne, with Caesar drawn into the conflict as her primary military backer, a meaningful and irreplaceable portion of ancient written knowledge was lost. A family power struggle had set fire to human history's collective memory. The Alexandrian War was not simply Cleopatra against Ptolemy XIII. Cleopatra had another sibling, Arsinoe IV, a younger sister. During the siege, Arsinoe escaped from the palace district controlled by Caesar's forces and joined the Egyptian army besieging them, where she was declared queen by the besieging forces. This detail is significant because it demonstrates something crucial about the actual political situation. It was not simply a binary conflict between Cleopatra and her brother. The Egyptian military command was willing to discard Ptolemy XIII's faction's nominal leadership entirely and rally around whichever royal sibling seemed most capable of leading effective resistance against the Roman force occupying Alexandria. Arsinoe, with the assistance of a eunuch advisor named Ganymedes, took effective command of the Egyptian military effort. Ganymedes reportedly orchestrated the poisoning of Achilles in a power struggle within the besieging force itself, meaning that even the faction fighting against Cleopatra was tearing itself apart through internal assassination. This is the level of brutal internal competition that characterized Ptolemaic politics. Even within a single faction united against a common enemy, the participants were still murdering each other for position. The siege continued through these internal Egyptian power struggles until Roman reinforcements, additional legions that Caesar had summoned from Syria and Asia Minor, finally arrived in early 47 BC. With reinforcements, Caesar's position shifted from defensive siege to offensive campaign. The decisive engagement came at the Battle of the Nile in early 47 BC. Caesar's reinforced army moved against the combined Egyptian forces. The battle resulted in a decisive defeat for Ptolemy XIII's army. Ptolemy XIII, attempting to escape the collapsing Egyptian position, drowned in the Nile River. The accounts of his death vary somewhat in their details, whether his boat capsized under the weight of fleeing soldiers, whether he was attempting to cross under fire, but the essential fact is consistent across the sources. The 10-year-old boy who had been married to his sister, used as a figurehead by court officials who controlled him and turned into the nominal leader of a war against his own sister, drowned trying to flee the battle that war had produced. He was approximately 14 or 15 years old at his death, a child king manipulated by adult advisors into a war he had no independent capacity to understand or control. Dead in a river because the political faction managing him had bet everything on a military confrontation with Rome and lost. Cleopatra was now, with Caesar's military backing, the uncontested ruler of Egypt. She had her brother's body recovered, according to some accounts displayed publicly to confirm his death and remove any possibility of a pretender later claiming to be the surviving Ptolemy XIII. She also, per Ptolemaic custom, requiring co-rule rather than solitary female rule, was married to her remaining younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. He was approximately 11 or 12 years old at the time. Cleopatra was 22. Arsinoe IV, captured after the Egyptian defeat, was taken by Caesar as a prisoner. She was paraded in Caesar's triumph in Rome in 46 BC, a Roman general's celebratory procession through the city, displaying defeated enemies and captured treasures, with Arsinoe presented in chains as a conquered foreign royal. This was, by Roman standards, an unusual humiliation. Triumphal processions traditionally ended with the execution of high-status prisoners. Arsinoe was, unusually, spared this fate and instead exiled to the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. She remained there for years, a potential rallying point for anyone who might want to challenge Cleopatra's rule by promoting an alternative royal claimant. Cleopatra clearly understood this risk. Years later, after Cleopatra's relationship with Mark Antony had developed into a full political and military partnership, Antony had Arsinoe executed at Ephesus, at the temple where she had taken refuge, violating its traditional sanctuary status. Historians widely understand this execution as being conducted at Cleopatra's instigation, removing the last sibling who represented a potential alternative claim to her throne. Of Ptolemy XII's children, Cleopatra ultimately survived all of them. Her sister Berenice IV had been executed by their father years earlier for a previous rebellion. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile. Arsinoe was executed at Ephesus. Ptolemy XIV, the younger brother she married after her first brother's death, died under circumstances ancient sources connect to poisoning, conveniently around the time Cleopatra's son with Julius Caesar was old enough to be positioned as her new co-ruler. Every sibling Cleopatra had, dead by the end of it, with her positioned as the sole survivor and uncontested ruler. The Alexandrian War and its aftermath happened before any of the relationships that made Cleopatra internationally famous had fully developed into the legendary narratives later centuries constructed around them. She was barely out of her teens through most of it, and what the actual historical record shows is not a woman whose primary historical significance rested on her relationships with powerful men, waiting passively for rescue or romance. It shows a teenage monarch who, when expelled from her own capital by a coup orchestrated by court officials managing her child husband, personally organised a mercenary army and marched on her own country to reclaim her throne by force. Who recognised with extraordinary speed and precision the political opportunity Caesar's arrival represented, and acted on it decisively before her brother's faction could shape the situation first. Who survived a months-long siege in her own capital, fighting alongside Roman reinforcements against her own country's military, and who, in the years following, systematically ensured that every sibling who might represent a competing claim to her throne was eliminated, through war, through execution, through means that ancient sources connect to poison. This is not a romantic story. It is the story of a young ruler operating in one of history's most brutal political systems, who understood from an extremely early age that survival required ruthlessness, and who applied that understanding with consistent, sustained effectiveness across more than a decade. The marriage to Caesar's political support, the later partnership with Antony, these were not romantic interludes in an otherwise simple royal life. They were tools, deployed by a strategist who had already proven, before any of those famous relationships began, that she was willing to fight a war against her own family and win it. Somewhere in the Nile, beneath water that has long since moved on, are whatever remains existed of a teenage boy named Ptolemy XIII, married to his sister at 10 years old, used as a political instrument by men who needed his name and his throne more than they needed his actual judgment, turned into the nominal leader of a war he had no real capacity to understand, drowned at 14, trying to escape a battle his advisors had engineered and lost. His sister and former wife survived him by 21 years. She went on to become one of the most famous women in human history. Caesar, Antony, the end of an independent Egypt, a death by snakebite or something resembling one that has been romanticized and dramatized for 2,000 years. But before any of that, there was this, an 18-year-old girl married to a 10-year-old boy because a dynasty's rules demanded it. A war between them that burned part of human knowledge to the ground, a river that took the boy and left the girl standing. She did not survive the Ptolemaic dynasty's brutal internal politics by accident. She survived it because she understood, earlier and more completely than almost anyone else in her family ever did, exactly what kind of game she was playing, and she played it better than any of them, including the people who were supposed to be on her side. If this is the Cleopatra story you were never taught, subscribe. The real history is always sharper than the legend.